All right, so this is going to be a short PowerPoint here where we talk about how we go from Tsarist Russia to Tsar Nicholas and pre-revolutionary Russia to a communist Bolshevik Soviet Union that's going to be led by Vladimir Lenin. So let's get into this. All right. So we look at pre-revolutionary Russia. Um, it's going to be really the only true autocracy left in Europe. I mean, I think you could make an argument certainly that like Austria and Germany had elements of this that like their government forms really lacked any kind of serious democratic elements in it. Um, or at least you could argue that like the democratic elements that they did have as part of their governments in Germany and Austria weren't at all relevant or effective, and therefore like that. All right, sorry about the interruption there. Okay, so what I was saying is that even though there certainly are elements of, bruh, all right, again, sorry I got interrupted twice in a row there. Um, so Germany, Austria have representative institutions, but they're not really relevant in the actual running of either of those empires. And so like a lot of people argue that like the Russian and German and Austrian forms of government were in fact a contributing factor in the coming of the war. So that's kind of where that comes from. The other thing, and we talked about this in class too, is just like the fact that they do have some slow economic and social reforms. That really happens in two waves. So like one, in the 1860, like 1860 through 1880, there are some social reforms that happen that bring about some economic change, largely as like the result of the expansion of railroads. And then like in after 1881, you have a repressive government that gets installed, but there are a lot of sort of economic, I shouldn't say a lot, that's too strong. There are economic changes that do happen that help industrialize parts of Russia, just not to the extent that any other country went through. Um, and so like there's still a massive amount of problems. They couldn't feed what was at the time the fastest growing population in Europe. And like the majority of their people are illiterate too. So like, Russian society just kind of as a whole was very backwards. Um, Another sort of key moment in this sort of lead up to the revolution, I know this ends up being 12 years before, but it's really important because um, in the wake of the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 and 1905, there's a revolution that breaks out because Russia really gets embarrassed by Japan, which at the time in kind of like world affairs, like Japan was considered a second-rate or second-tier um, empire, and so like for Russia not only to get beat by Japan, but really like get their butts whooped, is embarrassing to the Russian people, and like so not only do you have that, and like they associate like the beat down with like a weak government and ineffective government, but then the war kind of exasperates economic problems that were already sort of present in Russia, and so like they start protesting because of these economic problems, because of like the failure of the war, and like this leads to like a sort of like mini revolution. Um, and what ends up happening is that there's a sort of moment here where there's what's called Bloody Sunday, and the Tsar has troops fire on peaceful protesters, and I think like 300 people die in that. Like 1,000 more are injured. You can see the picture down here on the bottom right was like a depiction of Bloody Sunday. Um, and what's going to happen because of like the fiasco of like the Tsar firing on protesters is that like the protests are going to continue, and the Tsar has to sort of give concessions in order to kind of quell these uprisings. And so what the biggest sort of change that comes about in 1905 is that the Tsar is forced to create a national parliament, which is called in Russian history is called the Duma. Um, and the Duma could have been a potential sort of outlet for these liberal democratic yearnings of the very small middle class that was present in Russia. Um, but the Tsar like dissolves the Duma on multiple occasions, and to the point where like the Duma doesn't even become relevant anymore. Um, so like like the Duma had the potential to possibly move Russia forward in a different way, really away from like an autocratic form of government. But um, because of like the failure of the Tsar to utilize it, and then he actually goes and dissolves it, is going to prevent that from happening. Um, we're going to see like the rise of socialism and communism in the late 1800s really start to take place in Russia. Um, Lenin is actually going to form sort of the Bolshevik Party in the very late 1800s, and then it's going to become very prominent in the 1905 revolutions and helping sort of spur people to protest against the government. This is what's going to lead Lenin to get exiled to Switzerland. So Lenin becomes very, very popular um, in 1905 and sort of the chaos of the moment, and becomes a sort of vocal leader of the people. And so like the government gets rid of him and they send him to Switzerland. Um, and Lenin's interesting as a sort of communist leader because he's different than Marx in a couple important ways. Okay, um, like Marx is going to view Lenin's philosophy as um, like Marx going to see. Sorry, let's jump back to Marx. So Marx, like remember, Marx views history all as like progress, right? So you have uh, um, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So like, and so in that sort of process, like it was always constant progress. Like one thing happened, and then another reacted to it, and then like they combined and they formed something better. So in Marx's works, like Marx argued that capitalism was an essential step towards, it was like the precursor towards communism. And so that like that process was not only necessary, but that it was like um, you know that like there was just going to be a natural transfer as these changes happen. Lenin's going to be argued differently. So Lenin's going to argue that capitalism could only be destroyed by violent revolution, that there needed to be an overthrow of this system instead of like a like thesis, antithesis, they mesh, and then there's some synthesis. So like he's not going to sort of argue about communism being a sort of eventuality of a sort of blending of capitalism and socialism. He's also going to Lenin's going to argue against Marx and say that a socialist revolution was possible before capitalism had sort of run its course and had the effects that it did have. And he's also going to argue that the revolution must be controlled by a dedicated elite of intellectuals, not the workers like Marx wanted. So those three differences are really important. Okay, and so like this Bolshevik Party, like I said, it becomes really important in 1905, and so Lenin and Leon Trotsky started organizing Soviets, which Trotsky is the guy down here on the bottom. And Trotsky's going to end up being really important because he's Lenin's right-hand man. And once we get into the actual Russian Revolution and in the aftermath and the Russian Civil War, Trotsky's going to be the one that leads the military for Lenin. All right, so let's talk about World War I. Okay, so there's a number of factors that kind of lead into the sort of possibility for a revolution, but the war kind of provides the context for those problems to be exasperated. It's going to provide an immense amount of like suffering, death, economic problems, like starving, and so like the war is the context for all of these sort of underlying problems to come about. All right, and so the war and many people, especially, and we see this even in America, like many people called, I think as as history students we should realize this is like the war is essentially an imperialist war, right? And so these many average people saw that in countries all around the world, and especially in Russia, where that socialism and communism specifically had been spreading. Um, and so like the average peasant's going to have very little in this. They're going to be very poorly trained, um, both at sort of like a sort of lowest level possible, but also like the Russian military leaders were very poorly trained as well. Um, Russia hadn't fully industrialized yet, so it wasn't ready for an industrial war. So when it goes to war with Germany, and Germany had been going like the fastest industrializing country for a long time, is that they're going to be able to mass produce weapons and not only just mass produce them, but they're going to also have advantages as far as the types of weapons and the quality of weapons that Russians aren't going to have. And so um, the sort of horrific differences in the training, the weapons that the two sides, um, very quickly, the Russians are going to experience over 2 million casualties. All right, like in basically a year. Okay, and so the Russian army really starts to falling apart by 1915, just because of how sort of much they're being slaughtered by the Germans. All right, so if we look at sort of the path to revolution from 1915 to 1917, because the Russian army is falling apart, Nicholas is going to actually leave to lead the Russian troops, and what that does is it leaves, sorry, Alexandra, who was the Tsarina, and Rasputin in control, and these two people kind of throw the government into chaos because they are very, very poor political leaders, and they horribly mismanage the wartime economy. So industrial production is going to fall off the map. Inflation starts going rampant. People are starving because there's no food. And what's happening is that like because people are starving, they start really flowing and immigrating to the city areas where they think that the government could potentially help them out. And all that does is just causes more people to be sort of stricken with this like revolutionary spirit. Let's band together and do something about this. And so like this amount of suffering that is sort of in the context of the war, and the war is why the Russian Revolution happens in the short term, and allows the context for those revolutions to spring up. But just recognize that the sort of underlying causes of all these problems are sort of long in the making. And really kind of like the backstory to this is that the Tsarina is the son of the Tsar, had a genetic disorder and was hemophilia. Um, and the Tsarina knew that, and so Rasputin, when he was supposed to be like this, magical healer, and so she trusted him. And there's a bunch of weird things there, but these two are gonna get overthrown. Actually, I think actually Rasputin gets assassinated before the revolution actually breaks out. But what we need to know in 1917, there's two revolutions, okay, and most people don't realize this, okay, is that the first revolution in depending on which calendar you're using, the February and March Revolution, this is, so like the immediate cause of this overthrow is like food shortages and people starving. I think that you should recognize like the similarities between the French Revolution here and the Russian Revolution, that like even with the French Revolution, there's a lot of like long-term underlying problems that like cause the revolution at its core. But the reason that like the revolution actually springs about is that people are just suffering, and specifically starving. So this revolution is going to be really centered in St. Petersburg. Troops are going to have to be ordered to put down bread riots, which is going to make things work. And so what's going to happen is that once these troops start physically, violently putting down bread riots and worker strikes, they start to see that they're like persecuting their own people, and they actually, because the government is doing such a horrible job, the soldiers who had been sort of keeping things in line switch sides, and they support the people. And so what's going to happen is that Nicholas is going to abdicate. He's going to leave the throne, and the Duma, which had been reestablished, is going to declare a provisional government. The problem is that it didn't have the support of the troops or the workers, and so what's going to happen is in this sort of after this initial sort of revolution in Russia, there's going to be really effectively two governments. Is you're going to have like the troops and the workers who really were more closely tied to like the Bolsheviks and the side that will eventually be like the communists, and like the Duma, which was more of like the middle class people that wanted to have more of a democratic government. And so like these two competing sides are going to both be sort of pushing for political power basically from the spring to the fall. And eventually, obviously, we know that the communists are going to win out. The problem with two governments is a lot of chaos. Okay, so there's not going to be any kind of way in which like these problems are going to be resolved. And so, by the time we get to, again, whether it would depend on what calendar you're using, October, November, like Lenin's going to lead another revolution, and like he's going to sort of get people on board. He's going to say peace. We're going to end the war. He's going to give people food. And he's going to give people land. Okay, so peace, bread, and land. What is going to happen is that Lenin is actually really sort of smart in that like his initial policies were really popular with the broad base of people, because what he did is he gave peasants land, which they had already basically captured. Okay, so he says, you just basically affirm it's like government support of what the peasants had been doing out in rural Russia, is that they had peasants had gone crazy, killed nobles and took chunks of land, and basically the peasants had carved up and divided rural Russia, and he says, yeah, like this is a government policy. We we support this. This is what's going to happen, even though it already had happened. He also supported the workers taking over the factories, so he gets them on board. And so, like this revolution has a really broad support base. And I think what's really important is that despite their sort of actions that Lenin's going to take to support different various groups of people, is that they're able to stay in power. Okay, so during these, now this is going to be a while before they hold their first elections, but in that sort of first wave of elections, they only get roughly a third of the vote. And so what Lenin did is that Lenin very quickly gets rid of like the Duma. He disbands parliament, and like Russian democracy had only lasted for 8 months, and this had ended. Okay, and so like what we're going to see then is Lenin's going to have make some important changes and decisions to basically consolidate power and try to move Russia forward. So like I said, he's going to abolish private property. Even though peasants had already kind of done this, sorry, not that private property was abolished, like that private property was divided amongst the peasantry is a better way of saying that. We already talked about the worker stuff. He's going to reorganize the military and government, and he's going to move the government to Moscow. The military part has a lot to do with Leon Trotsky, which Trotsky is going to be very, very important when the Russian Civil War starts. And so he also signs a peace treaty with the Germans to get Russia out of World War I, because he realized that there was no way for them to really win, and that like the war was essentially like causing more problems for him to try to like get things under control. Now the problem is that the peace agreement that he signs with the Germans is horrible for Russia. So they lose 1/3 of their population in basically like the Ukrainian part of Russia. And they lose like 1/4 of their land. So it's like, I mean, the peace agreement that they sign is really bad. Now, these changes that Lenin makes are what are going to lead to the Russian Civil War in 1917, and it's going to last to 1920. So you have like basically the Bolsheviks fighting a bunch of different groups that kind of coalesce together to, basically try to destabilize the government, overthrow the communist government that had been established. And so this 3-year civil war that's fought, the biggest reason why the Bolsheviks are able to win is because Trotsky's Red Army was much more effective and disciplined, and also Lenin is able to create what he calls like war communism, which like mobilize the country's resources to fight. And so like the war communism that Lenin kind of installs is that like the state's going to take control of heavy industries to make sure that like um, these industries are producing as many war goods as they can. Now, what's good about this is that for at least for the Bolsheviks and even for like the average Russian person is like this sort of industrial mobilization and industrial change is going to like speed up Soviet like economic growth, and so like people start seeing the effects of that. Um, and so like that has a sort of impact in the short term. Now, what's going to be really problematic is that like in the rural areas, is that this civil war is really going to destroy the bulk of what the Soviet economy relied on, which was agriculture, and many people are going to suffer from that because like I said, like in the city areas where Lenin needed to have support, like he does because the industrialization had caused economic growth. However, in these more sort of like disbanded areas, agrarian rural areas, the war and the fighting is going to take a significant toll on agricultural output, which is going to be a problem, and it's going to like Lenin's going to have to respond to that. And just to kind of note here, and this is, I mean, kind of like an ancillary thing, but like the U.S. is going to support like the whites in this, and that like the Bolsheviks never forget that like the United States supported this side of this civil war that was trying to end communism. So just kind of that's one of those long-term sort of underlying agitators that we'll talk about once we get to the Cold War.